The town had a way of pretending everything was fine, even when it clearly was. Tucked deep in the valley, surrounded by hills that seemed to trap the fog each morning, it looked like one of those places where nothing bad could ever happen. The people knew each other by name, the church bells rang every Sunday, and gossip was the only form of entertainment. Yet beneath that peaceful surface, there was a heaviness in the air, something unspoken, something that made even the wind seem cautious as it passed through the empty streets. It was early autumn when the invitations went out. They were handwritten in elegant cursive on thick cream paper, sealed with a wax stamp that bore the initials of the two families. The wedding, the letter said, would be a union of love, tradition, and blood. Most thought it was just an old-fashioned way of speaking, something poetic, maybe even romantic. But a few people felt uneasy reading those words. They whispered among themselves, wondering what kind of family still talked like that. The church where the ceremony was set to take place stood at the heart of. It was a narrow stone building with ivy crawling up its walls and stained glass that painted the pews in red and blue light when the sun hit it right. Inside, it always smelled faintly of candle wax and dust. The priest, father, had served there for over 30 years. He was known to be calm and patient, the kind of man who could listen for hours without interrupting. Lately, though, he had grown tired. His sermons had become shorter, his tone softer, as if the faith that once filled his voice was slowly slipping away. The two families, the and the, were some of the oldest in. Their names were carved into the town's history, their wealth built generations ago through land, livestock, and quiet deals made behind closed doors. Everyone knew that when the and the were involved, there were things better left unasked. They owned half the valley, and they acted like it. When their children announced they were to be married, people said it was destiny, the bloodline continuing, as the elders liked to say. No one questioned it. Old money was still treated like royalty, and royalty could do no wrong. The bride had grown up in the big white house at the edge of town, the one surrounded by iron gates and roses that never seemed to die, no matter the season. She was beautiful in that cold, distant way that made people stare but never approach. Her pale skin, her quiet voice, her habit of looking past you instead of at you, it all gave her an air of something untouchable. She was polite, soft-spoken, but there was always something behind her eyes, something tired. The groom, Samuel, was the opposite in almost every way. Tall, confident, with that easy charm that made people trust him too quickly. He had the kind of smile that belonged on campaign posters, yet those who spent enough time around him knew there was something rehearsed about it, like it had been practiced in front of a mirror. He spoke often about family pride and keeping tradition alive, and though most didn't understand what he meant, they nodded anyway. The two had grown up together, their families always intertwined. It was said that their great-grandfathers had been cousins, but in a town like that sort of thing was just part of history. Everyone related to someone somehow. Still, when word spread that and Samuel would marry, a few people whispered that it wasn't right. The town's oldest midwife, Mrs., said she'd seen too much of the blood in the faces to call it a coincidence. But people dismissed her as an old woman chasing ghosts. The week before the wedding began to change. The church bells stopped ringing. The old mechanism had jammed, father said. The air felt thicker somehow, like the weather couldn't make up its mind. At night, stray dogs howled near the property, and a strange sound echoed from the hills, low, distant, and rhythmic, almost like someone humming under their breath. Father started having trouble sleeping. He told himself it was the stress of the upcoming ceremony, the biggest the town had seen in decades, but deep down he felt something was wrong. He couldn't explain it. Every time he stepped into the church to prepare, he felt a chill that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. He'd stare at the altar for long moments, trying to shake off the thought that he was being watched. Meanwhile, the families were busy with preparations. The estate was filled with florists, tailors, and servants rushing about like bees. The bride's dress, imported from France, was said to have been made from lace older than the church itself. The guest list included people from nearby towns, businessmen, landowners, and old family friends. Every detail had been planned with precision, yet the closer the day came, the more restless everyone seemed. One night, a storm swept through the valley. The lightning lit up the sky in flashes that turned the house into a ghostly silhouette. Inside, stood by her window, staring at her reflection. Her mother had left a note on her dressing table reminding her to rest. Tomorrow is the most important day of our bloodline, it said. Read it twice, her expression unreadable. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. She pressed her hand against the glass, her fingertips trembling slightly, and whispered something no one else would ever hear. The morning after, the sun returned as if nothing had happened. The valley looked calm again, the church decorated in white lilies and silk ribbons. The townspeople arrived dressed in their best clothes, smiling, chatting, pretending not to notice the unease in their stomachs. They filled the pews, waiting for the ceremony to begin. Father stood at the altar, hands clasped tightly. His eyes moved across the crowd, landing on the two families seated in the front rows, the on one side, the on the other. Their faces were nearly identical in some ways, the same pale complexions, the same sharp blue eyes. It was hard to tell where one family ended and the other began. When the organ started to play, the doors at the back of the church opened and appeared. Her dress shimmered softly in the light from the stained glass. She walked slowly down the aisle, each step measured, each breath shallow. Samuel waited for her, smiling that perfect smile. And yet, as the two of them met at the altar, Father's throat went dry. He couldn't explain why, but looking at them, he felt something deep inside him begin to crack. There was love in their eyes, perhaps, but there was something else too, something older, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. The priest blinked hard, trying to steady his voice. The church fell silent. Outside, a wind began to rise, and as Father opened his mouth to speak, to begin the ceremony that would bind two ancient families together once again, the candles flickered. No one noticed, but his hands were shaking. After the wedding, the town could talk of nothing else. People said it had been beautiful, unforgettable, the kind of ceremony that would be remembered for years. But those who were there, who had seen Father's pale face and trembling hands, spoke differently when no one was listening. Something had been off. The silence before the vows, the flickering candles, the strange look in the bride's eyes. Some said the priest had hesitated before speaking. Others swore they'd heard him whisper something under his breath before finally blessing the union. For in Samuel, life after the wedding wasn't the people expected. The newlyweds moved into the estate, an enormous house built long ago on a hill that overlooked the valley. The walls were covered with portraits, faces of ancestors long gone, all painted with the same sharp features and cold eyes. Spent her first night wandering the hallways, her footsteps echoing in the dark. She often stopped at the paintings, staring at them for long moments as if searching for something familiar in their faces. Samuel, meanwhile, grew distant. He was often gone before dawn and returned late at night, his clothes smelling faintly of smoke and whiskey. When asked where he went, he smiled and said he was taking care of family business. But the truth was, he had started drinking heavily, more than anyone knew. The pressure of carrying the name, of keeping up appearances, was breaking him from the inside. He'd inherited not only wealth, but also a legacy built on secrets. The end had always been close, but now their connection became suffocating. Every weekend, they gathered for long dinners where the conversation always turned to family history, to bloodlines and duty. Hated those nights. Her mother-in-law had a way of staring at her that made her feel small, as if she were being measured and found lacking. "You must remember," would say softly, "we are not like other families, we protect what is ours." Would nod and smile, but inside she felt trapped. The house, the dinners, the endless talk of legacy, it was as if her whole life had been swallowed by something ancient and dark. She had married a man she thought she knew, but each day she discovered new parts of him that frightened her. He spoke often about purity, about keeping the bloodline strong. At first, she thought he was joking. Then she realized he was. One night, while cleaning out one of the rooms in the house, found a box hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside were letters, old, brittle with age, written in the same elegant handwriting she had seen on their wedding invitations. Most were addressed to Samuel's great-grandfather, but a few bore the name. The letters spoke of arrangements, of keeping the lineage unbroken, and of marriages planned long before the children were even born. Some were dated more than 100 years ago. She sat on the floor for hours, reading in silence as the pieces began to fit together. The end hadn't just been close. It had been binding their families together by blood for generations. The marriages, the traditions, the obsession with lineage, it all came from the same belief, that their blood was sacred and it must never be diluted. When Samuel found her reading the letters, his face turned pale. He snatched them from her hands and told her never to go through his family's things again. His voice was low, almost trembling with anger. But it wasn't just anger, there was fear in his eyes. "You don't understand," he said. "This isn't just history, it's who we are." From that night, things between them began to break. Samuel became controlling, possessive. He followed every move, questioning where she went, who she spoke to. He told her the world outside their home didn't matter, that the family was all that counted. Once quiet and obedient, began to fight back in small ways. She started locking the bedroom door at night. She refused to attend the family dinners. She would sit for hours by the window, staring down at the town below, longing to escape. Father, who had not been seen much since the wedding, began to act strangely as well. He stopped attending social gatherings, rarely left the church, and when people saw him, he looked thinner, hollow-eyed. Some said he'd lost his faith. Others whispered that something had happened that day at the altar, something only he had seen. Late at night, the caretaker heard him packing inside the church, talking to himself, repeating words that made no sense. "The blood," he would say. "It's never been clean." The townspeople began to notice small things, unsettling things. Livestock found dead with no clear cause. Strange lights flickering in the windows of the estate long after midnight. Once a servant ran from the house screaming that she'd seen faces moving in the mirrors. By morning, she was gone. Samuel told everyone she'd been sent away for stealing. No one believed him. Money, too, had started to run thin. The fortune was not as endless as it seemed. Samuel's father had gambled much of it away before his death, and the rest was tied up in properties that were losing value. Samuel felt the pressure of generations weighing on him. His mother pushed him to secure new investments, to maintain the illusion of power, but he was in over his head. He owed money to men from the city, men who didn't care about old family names. Began to receive strange visits. An old woman came to the door one afternoon claiming to have known her grandmother. She handed a small silver pendant shaped like a cross, but with markings didn't recognize. "You're not the first," the woman said quietly, "but you could be the last." When asked what she meant, the woman only smiled sadly and walked away. The next day, Samuel found the pendant and threw it into the fire. He said it was cursed, that outsiders wanted to destroy their family, but could still see it sometimes in her dreams, glowing faintly in the ashes. As the months passed, the tension inside the house grew unbearable. Samuel's temper worsened. He began to hear things, voices whispering in the halls, calling his name. Tried to tell him they weren't real, but he insisted they were their ancestors, watching over them. He said the family expected something from him, something he hadn't yet given. Started sleeping in one of the guest rooms, locking the door from the inside. She'd wake in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside her room, slow and deliberate, stopping just beyond the door. Sometimes she'd hear him whisper through the wood, "We need to finish what they started." One night she fled to the church. She found Father kneeling before the altar, his hands trembling as he prayed. When he saw her, he looked terrified, as though she were a ghost. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. "They'll know," begged him to explain what was happening, but he only shook his head. "There are things in that house older than you, older than me. You were never meant to marry him. None of you were." The priest's words haunted her as she walked back home through the fog. When she reached the estate, the house was silent, every window dark except one, the attic. The light flickered softly as if someone were moving around up there, had never been allowed in the attic. Samuel had locked it, saying it was where the family's private records were kept. But that night she climbed the stairs and found the door slightly open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of something sweet and rotten. Old trunks and furniture were stacked against the walls. In the center of the room stood a long wooden table covered with yellowed papers, photographs, and jars filled with cloudy liquid. Some of the jars held what looked like small, preserved organs. Others contained strands of hair labeled with dates. On the far wall hung a massive family tree, drawn in black ink, the names connecting in a tangled mess. She followed the lines with her finger, tracing them back through generations. The same names appeared again and again, until they became indistinguishable. Her own name was there too, written in neat script beside Samuel. But there was another line beneath it, blank, waiting to be filled. Suddenly she heard footsteps behind her. Samuel was standing in the doorway, his eyes wild, his face pale and slick with sweat. "You weren't supposed to see this," he whispered. "You've ruined everything." His voice was calm at first, but it cracked as he stepped closer. He told her that the family had chosen them, that their marriage wasn't just tradition, it was sacrifice. Every generation had one couple chosen to renew the blood. Father had known, he said. That was why he had gone silent after the wedding. He'd seen what the ritual really was. Backed away, her heart pounding. She didn't want to believe him, but the proof was all around her. The letters, the jars, the family tree, it all fit together in a way that made her stomach turn. Samuel reached for her, his voice breaking now, pleading. "It's the only way," he said. "If we don't, everything will die. The land, the name, us." She screamed and ran, slamming the attic door behind her. Downstairs, the candles flickered violently, as if the whole house had taken a breath. She locked herself in the parlor, trembling as his footsteps echoed above her, packing, muttering to himself. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. By morning, the house was quiet again. Samuel didn't come down. sat by the window, her eyes red from crying, staring at the hills beyond the valley. Somewhere inside her, she knew this wasn't over. Whatever madness had taken root in that family, it was spreading. And as the sun rose over, Father stood at the edge of the churchyard, watching the estate from a distance. His lips moved soundlessly, his hands shaking as he crossed himself. He knew what was coming. He had seen it before. The blood never stays buried for long. The night it happened was wrapped in a storm so violent that even the river seemed to rage. The rain came down in heavy sheets, flooding the cobblestone streets and turning the fields into pools of mud. Thunder cracked like gunfire, echoing across the valley. Inside the estate, every window shook with the force of the wind. The old house groaned as if alive, its walls creaking, its chandeliers swaying. Hadn't slept for days. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow from fear and exhaustion. The memory of what she had seen in the attic still clung to her like a shadow she couldn't wash off. Since that night, Samuel had locked the attic door and carried the key on a chain around his neck. He spoke less now, his words turning into murmurs, prayers, fragments of something she didn't understand. Sometimes she'd wake to find him standing over her, whispering about the blood debt and how the ancestors were growing restless. That evening he told her it had to be done before the next sunrise. He said the signs were clear, the storm, the voices, the sudden death of 2 servants the day before. "They've chosen us," he whispered, his eyes wide and glistening. "We have to finish the vow." Tried to run. She packed a small bag in secret, waiting for him to fall asleep. But when she reached the main door, she found it bolted from the outside. The rain beat hard against the windows and the power flickered. In the dim light, she could see Samuel standing at the end of the hallway, watching her. His face was calm, too calm, as if he'd been expecting it. "Where would you go?" he asked quietly. "You belong here, you always have." His voice was gentle, but his eyes were empty. He stepped closer, holding something in his hand, a silver blade, long and old, its handle carved with the same symbols she'd seen in the letters. The sight of it made her stomach twist. "It won't hurt," he said. "It's what they want." Backed away, tears blurring her vision. "You're sick," she whispered. "This isn't real." He smiled faintly. "You said the same thing about love." Lightning flashed through the window, illuminating his face. For a moment she saw not the man she had married, but something else, something ancient and broken, wearing his body like a mask. He lunged forward and she screamed, dodging as the blade slashed through the air. It struck the wooden door behind her, splintering it. She ran, barefoot and trembling, through the maze of corridors. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. Behind her, his footsteps followed, steady, relentless. She ran toward the drawing room, the one with the grand mirror that stretched from floor to ceiling. When she reached it, she froze. The reflection staring back at her wasn't her own. It was Samuel's face, standing right behind her, though she hadn't heard him enter. He was smiling in the reflection, but not in real life. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, he was gone. The room was silent except for the rain, turned slowly, gripping the edge of the fireplace for balance. Then she heard it, his voice, soft and close, whispering her name. She spun around, but he was nowhere in sight. The whisper came again, this time from the hallway. Her legs shook as she crept toward the sound. The house felt alive, every creak, every shadow seemed to follow her. When she reached the main staircase, she stopped. Samuel was standing halfway up the steps, barefoot, drenched in rain, the silver blade glinting in his hand. His expression was blank, his hair plastered to his forehead. "Do you know what my grandfather said?" he murmured. "He said the bloodline must be renewed no matter the cost. He said the last time someone refused, the valley turned to rot, the crops died. Children were born wrong." His voice shook. "You don't have to do this." He laughed softly, almost kindly. "It's already done." She turned and ran again, this time toward the kitchen. The power flickered out completely, leaving her in darkness. She grabbed a candlestick from the counter and struck a match, her trembling hands barely steady enough to light it. The faint flame revealed the kitchen walls, lined with knives, old tools, and glass jars that shimmered in the flickering light. She could hear his footsteps again, slower this time, echoing across the tile floor. "Do you hear them?" he asked. "They're here with us." She didn't answer. She grabbed one of the knives and backed against the counter, the candle's flame dancing wildly as the wind howled through a cracked window. Samuel stepped into the room, his eyes wide and feverish. "It's not murder," he said. "It's a promise." Then he moved toward her. The next few seconds were chaos, screams, the sound of metal clashing, the crash of glass shattering. The candle fell, its flame flickering out as the storm raged outside. In the dark, there was only the sound of struggle, the dull thud of bodies colliding, the hiss of rain slipping through broken windows. When the lightning struck again, it illuminated the scene for just a moment, standing over Samuel, her dress torn, her face streaked with blood and tears. The knife in her hand trembled as she stared down at him. He was on the floor, the blade buried deep in his chest. His eyes were still open, fixed on her, but whatever had been inside them, the madness, the voice that wasn't his, was gone. He looked almost peaceful. Dropped the knife and stumbled backward, gasping. Her hands shook uncontrollably. She whispered his name again and again as if it might wake him, but he didn't move. The storm outside roared louder and the house seemed to moan with it. She sank to the floor beside him, sobbing until her throat burned. She didn't know how long she stayed there, minutes, hours. Eventually, she crawled to the window, pushing it open to let in the rain. It poured over her face, washing away the blood but not the memory. Father arrived just before dawn. He had walked through the storm, guided by something he couldn't explain, a dream, a whisper, a pull. When he entered the house, he found the door unlocked, swinging slightly in the wind. The smell hit him first, blood and wet earth. His steps echoed through the empty halls until he reached the kitchen. Sat on the floor, drenched, her eyes distant and glassy. Samuel lay beside her, still and pale. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The priest's hands trembled as he took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. "What happened?" he asked softly. Lips moved, but no sound came out. She looked at him, then at the body, and finally at the ceiling, as if listening for something far away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "They wanted blood." Father swallowed hard, his eyes filling with tears. He had known this day would come. The curse of the families had always ended this way, with sacrifice, with madness, with death. He knelt beside Samuel's body and closed his eyes. "God forgive us," he whispered. The rain began to ease, the sky turning pale with the first light of morning. Sat motionless, her dress soaked and torn, her hands stained red. The priest wanted to believe it was over, that the evil had died with Samuel. But as he looked around the room, he noticed something that made his stomach twist. On the far wall, written in what looked like blood, were the words, "It never ends." He turned back to, but she was staring at the same message, her expression empty. Outside, the last echo of thunder rolled across the valley. The storm had passed, but the air still carried that same heavy stillness, the kind that comes after something terrible has happened. The priest stayed with her until the sun rose fully, its light falling over the blood-stained floor. He didn't speak again. He couldn't. The words caught in his throat, frozen by the realization that he had stood at that same altar months ago and blessed a union that should never have been. And as the first rays of dawn touched Samuel's lifeless face, Father finally understood what the old families had meant by keeping their bloodline pure. It wasn't purity they were protecting. It was a curse, and now it had claimed them both. The storm had ended, but the silence that followed was heavier than the thunder that had shaken the valley. The estate stood quiet and cold, its windows shattered, its doors hanging open. The police arrived after sunrise, summoned by Father's trembling hands. They moved through the house carefully, speaking in low voices, their boots leaving muddy prints on the marble floors. In the kitchen, they found the knife, the blood, and the body. Was sitting where the priest had left her, her hands folded in her lap, her face blank and distant. When they tried to question her, she didn't answer. Her lips moved now and then, but her words made no sense. One of the officers said she was in shock, another called it madness. Either way, they took her away quietly, wrapping her in a blanket, leading her out into the pale morning light. The townspeople had gathered beyond the gates, whispering as they watched the young widow walk past. Some cried, others crossed themselves. But most just stared, trying to make sense of what they were seeing, the tragedy that had shattered the oldest and proudest family in. The newspapers arrived within a day. Heiress found at center of shocking family murder, the headlines read. Reporters from neighboring towns flooded the valley, desperate to piece together the story. They spoke of family secrets, whispers of inbreeding, rumors of curses and rituals. None of them truly knew the truth, but the legend of the families was too strange to ignore. Within a week, the story had spread across the region. People who had once the family's wealth now spoke of them with disgust and pity. Father was questioned, of course. He told the police what he could, though most of it sounded like the ramblings of a haunted man. He spoke of the wedding, the strange feeling in the church, the silence that had followed. He told them about the family's obsession with bloodlines, about the letters he'd once seen but could no longer find. The police wrote it down, but they didn't believe much of it. In the official report, Samuel's death was listed as the result of a domestic dispute turned violent. The rest, the talk of curses and blood rituals, was buried under the label of superstition. But the priest knew better. He stopped preaching after that day. He still went to the church, but he never spoke during Mass. The congregation would sit in silence, waiting, while he stared at the crucifix as if expecting it to speak back. Some said he'd lost his faith. Others said he'd seen something too terrible to ever repeat. Late at night, people walking past the church claimed they could hear him praying in Latin, his voice shaking, his words half-choked by tears. Was taken to a hospital on the outskirts of the county. The doctors said she suffered from trauma-induced psychosis. She barely ate, rarely spoke, and spent most of her time sitting by the window of her room, watching the rain. When she did talk, she spoke in fragments about voices in the walls, the bloodline, and Samuel waiting in the house. The nurses heard, but even they kept their distance. There was something about her calmness that felt wrong, something that made them uneasy. Months passed and the world moved on but didn't. The estate was sealed off, its doors locked, its gardens overgrown. The once beautiful property became a ghost of itself. The family retreated from public life entirely. His parents sold their land and left town without a word, their mansion boarded up, the windows dark. No one saw them again. But the whispers never stopped. Some said had gone insane after years of being controlled by her husband. Others believed she'd been possessed, that the madness of their ancestors had finally found its way into her blood. Some claimed that on stormy nights, lights still flickered inside the house, though no one had lived there since that morning. Father, the guilt was unbearable. He blamed himself for ever agreeing to marry them. He replayed that day over and over in his mind, the trembling candles, the whisper that had brushed against his ear as he spoke the vows. Sometimes in his dreams he could still hear Samuel's voice saying, "It's already done." He stopped sleeping altogether. His hair turned white in a matter of months, and his sermons ceased entirely. One morning he was found sitting in the front pew, his eyes open but lifeless. In his hand was a small piece of paper with 3 words written in his shaky handwriting: "The blood won't rest." The police closed the case soon after. They said it was a tragedy, nothing more. But for those who lived in, the story became something else, something whispered about at night, something parents used to warn their children. "Never marry for blood," they would say. "Look what happened to the..." Years later, a new family bought the estate. They were outsiders, people who didn't believe in old curses or local tales. They renovated the house, cut back the ivy, and repainted the walls. For a time, it seemed as if the past had finally faded. But the workers who restored the attic told a different story. They said they found jars hidden behind the walls, old photographs, and a large family tree drawn in black ink. The last line was still empty, with the names of Samuel and written just above. The new owners had it removed and burned, but the night after, the fire alarm went off for no reason. All the lights in the house flickered at once, and one of the workers swore he saw someone standing in the attic window, a woman in a white dress, her face pale as glass. By morning, no one would admit to seeing it, but they all left the property soon after, refusing to work there again. As for no one truly knew what became of her. The hospital kept her records private, though it was said she spent the rest of her life in silence. Some claimed she died there, her heart giving out one winter night as snow fell softly outside her window. Others believed she escaped, that she vanished one night, leaving her hospital gown folded neatly on the bed. A few months later, a traveler passing through claimed to have seen her standing near the gates of the old house, staring up at the attic window, her hair whipping in the wind. The town eventually grew quieter, older. The children who once whispered the story became adults, and their own children heard it as a warning rather than the truth. But the valley never fully recovered. The air always seemed a little colder near the estate, and now and then the church bell would ring by itself, 3 times, slow and hollow, echoing through the hills. People would stop and listen, their faces pale. And someone would always murmur the same thing, that the bell tolled for those who couldn't rest, for the family who tried too hard to keep their blood pure. And far away in the old hospital records that no one ever checked, a note was found years later under his name. It was written in her handwriting, though shaky and faint. "They said the bloodline would end with us," it read, "but I still hear them, they're calling me home." No one ever knew what she meant by that. But sometimes, when the wind howled through and the rain returned to the valley, people swore they could hear laughter echoing faintly from the hills. The sound of a woman's voice, soft and distant, carried through the storm. And those who heard it would close their windows, whisper a prayer, and remember the wedding that cursed an entire town. The wedding hall sits empty now, its walls cold with silence, the air heavy with what can't be erased. The garlands that once hung bright and sweet now droop brown and wilted. What happened inside the church didn't just take lives, it broke something in everyone who ever knew them. The story became legend, whispered through the small valley town like a curse. Some said justice was served. Others said it never could be. But no one argued about one thing, no soul left that wedding untouched. After the screams faded and the truth clawed its way out, the law came slow but sure. The investigation stretched for weeks. Every villager was questioned, every thread of the family's tangled history unraveled in the open. It turned out that what happened wasn't sudden, it was years in the making. The blood ties, the secrets, the greed that festered behind polite smiles, it all led here. The priest, who had once been their moral anchor, was gone. His death felt like a divine silence, as if God himself refused to speak after what he'd witnessed. Isaac was the first to be arrested. His face was pale, his clothes still stained from that night. When they dragged him away, he didn't fight, didn't cry, just muttered something about how it was never supposed to end like this. When asked why he did it, he said one thing over and over: "You can't fix what's already broken." They found journals later, filled with rants about control, purity, and love twisted into something monstrous. The courts saw him as a product of madness, but those who'd known him said he was too calm, too cold to be insane. Broken and barely alive from a hospital bed. Her eyes were distant, her voice cracked and slow. She spoke not just of the night of the crime, but of all the small horrors that came before, the manipulation, the control, the way she'd been made to believe that love meant obedience. Her story shook everyone who heard it. People started questioning things they had always accepted about their own families, their marriages, their traditions. That was the real legacy of that night. It cracked open the comfortable lies people told themselves about what was normal. The courtroom was packed every day of the trial. Neighbors, journalists, even tourists from nearby towns came to watch. The air inside was tense, heavy with disgust and curiosity. The prosecution laid out a story of obsession and control. The defense claimed generational trauma and moral decay had created a man who couldn't tell right from wrong. When the verdict came, life in prison, no one clapped, no one cheered. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like punishment for everyone who had ever turned a blind eye. The village itself changed after that. People avoided the church. Weddings were moved elsewhere. The old families who had once ruled the town with their money and pride found their reputations rotting. Whispers spread about curses and bad blood. Children grew up hearing the story like a bedtime warning about what happens when love turns into ownership and pride disguises itself as protection. Never returned to her family home. She left town quietly one morning, a small bag in hand, wearing a gray coat that swallowed her thin frame. Some said she went to the city, others that she joined a convent far away. No one knew for sure, but those who remembered her said she was never the same. She had survived the fire, but something inside her had been burned forever. In the years that followed, documentaries and books tried to make sense of it. Reporters dug through archives, piecing together the madness that led to that night. They called it the Inbred wedding, a name that made people shiver. But the deeper truth wasn't just about bloodlines, it was about power, about how people with control can twist love into chains, how silence can be more violent than words. The priest's name was carved into the church's stone wall, but his voice was never heard again. His journals, found later, showed a man drowning in guilt. He had known things weren't right long before the wedding. He had seen the manipulation, the control, the strange, possessive bond between the families, but he had stayed quiet, afraid of breaking the peace, afraid of the people he served. In the end, silence killed him too. Justice, if you could call it that, came on paper and through bars. But for the town, for the families, justice meant nothing compared to the shame. The children grew up under the weight of their last names. Businesses closed, people moved away. And that church, once the heart of the town, stood empty for years, a scar of stone and silence. Looking back, it's hard to say where the evil began. Maybe it started with pride, maybe with fear. Maybe it began generations ago, when people believed blood was thicker than truth. But what happened in that church proved something terrible and simple, that love, when built on control and silence, becomes a weapon. Every November, when the air turns cold and the valley fog rolls in thick, some locals say they still hear church bells echoing faintly through the hills, though the bell was removed years ago. They say it's a reminder that even in silence the past speaks. And maybe that's the only real justice that came out of it, not in prison cells or verdicts, but in remembrance. The kind that stings enough to keep people honest. The kind that reminds everyone that love without truth will always lead to ruin. In the end, the story of that wedding became less about death and more about what it exposed. The power games behind smiles, the rot beneath tradition, the pain hidden behind respectability. It forced everyone to face what they'd ignored, and that, more than any sentence, was the punishment that lingered. No one forgot, and no one dared to hold another wedding in that church again.